In the hushed, cathedral-like halls of power, where fortunes are won and lost on the whisper of a rumor, the true apex predator is never the loudest beast in the jungle. It is the one that goes unseen, the one you dismiss until its teeth are at your throat. Inside the sovereign, Chicago's temple of aged beef and clandestine deals, 5 such predators had just been seated. Their target was the lion of the city's industry, the old money titan Julian Croft, a man whose empire of steel and logistics was as much a part of the city's skyline as the Willis Tower. The 5 men were sharks in tailored suits, professionals in the bloody business of corporate warfare. They had planned for everything: Croft's security, the restaurant's layout, the city's response time. But they had made one catastrophic, unforgivable error in their calculations. They had completely ignored the waitress, the quiet, unassuming young woman named Allara Vance, who was at that very moment refilling their water glasses. They saw a servant, a fleeting shadow in a starched apron. They had no idea they had just walked into her web, not theirs. The air in the sovereign was thick with the scent of inherited wealth. It wasn't the flashy, pungent aroma of new tech money, but the subtle, layered perfume of generational power, the oaky notes of $100 glasses of scotch, the buttery richness of Dover Soul, and the faint, almost metallic tang of ambition that clung to the velvet curtains. For Allara Vance, this was the smell of a world she audited from the outside. Her life here was a carefully constructed fiction, a performance of quiet deference and flawless efficiency. She moved between the tables with a practiced grace, her steps silent on the plush Persian rugs, her presence so unobtrusive that the titans of industry barely registered her existence as she cleared their plates. Tonight, a frigid Tuesday in November, the restaurant buzzed with its usual clientele. Commodity brokers from the Board of Trade argued in hushed, aggressive tones. A legacy family from the North Shore picked at their Chateaubriand with the boredom of those who have never known hunger. Allara navigated this ecosystem with an economy of motion that was almost unnerving to anyone who bothered to truly watch her. Her hands were steady, her posture perfect, but her eyes were never still. They were her tools, honed by a past she fought daily to forget. She saw everything. She saw the almost imperceptible tremor in the hand of the hedge fund manager at table 3 as he signed a check, a sign of a man leveraged to his absolute limit. She saw the way the woman at table 5, a political fundraiser, subtly angled her phone to hide the text message she was typing from her dining companion. She noted the brand of watch on each man's wrist, the quality of the leather in their shoes, the tiny tells that broadcasted a person's financial and emotional state more loudly than any bank statement. These were the micro-dramas of the elite, her nightly distraction from the low, constant thrum of vigilance that was coded into her DNA. She had been at the Sovereign for 14 months. 14 months of methodical routine, of calculated anonymity. It was the longest she had held any job since her life had been shattered 5 years ago. Here she was just Allara, the quiet waitress with an uncanny memory for wine pairings. No one knew the woman she had been, the woman whose mind was trained to dissect billion-dollar fraud schemes and trace the flow of dark money across continents. No one could possibly guess that her placid exterior was a fortress built to contain a knowledge so dangerous it had almost gotten her killed. At precisely 8:15 p.m., the delicate equilibrium of the room tilted. It was a minute shift, a change in barometric pressure that only a creature of instinct, like Allara, would notice. The heavy oak doors swung open, and Julian Croft swept in, not with the arrogance of a man who owned the room, but with the weary entitlement of a man who owned the block it stood on. Croft was a relic from another era, the last of the great industrialists. His face, etched with the lines of 1,000 boardroom battles, was a permanent mask of patrician disapproval. He was tall, dressed in a somber, impeccably tailored suit that cost more than Allara's annual earnings, and he radiated an aura of impatient gravity. The world, to Julian Croft, was a massive, inefficient machine that he was perpetually trying to streamline. He was flanked by 2 men. The first, a bull-necked man in his 50s named Graves, was Croft's head of security, a former Secret Service agent whose face was a roadmap of past conflicts. The second was Croft's attorney, a nervous, bird-like man clutching a leather briefcase as if it contained the crown jewels. The maitre d', a man named Antoine, who could intimidate senators, bowed his head in a gesture of pure fealty. "Mr. Croft, your usual table is ready." "The usual, Antoine," Croft grumbled, his voice a low rumble of gravel and authority. He didn't look at the maitre d', his gaze already sweeping the room, assessing, categorizing, dismissing. "And tell the kitchen the Delmonico, rare, not medium rare. If I see a hint of pink beyond the center, I'll send it back." They were led to table 1, the king's seat, a large circular booth nestled in a secluded alcove, offering a commanding view of the entire dining room while remaining insulated from its noise. It was, of course, in Allara's section. Allara approached, her notepad held ready. It was a role she played to perfection. "Good evening, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice soft and professional. "May I get you something to drink to start? Perhaps the Macallan 30? Croft waved a dismissive hand, his eyes on a document his lawyer had slid from the briefcase. "Just water. Still, no ice. And tell the sommelier to decant the 82 Margaux. Have it ready with the steaks." He glanced up at her for the first time, and his eyes, a pale, unforgiving blue, passed over her as if she were a lamp fixture. "And girl," he added, his tone sharp, "don't linger. I'm conducting business. We'll signal you if we need anything." "Of course, sir," Allara replied, her voice a perfect, smooth mask of neutrality. She held his gaze for a bare second, just long enough to register her compliance, but not long enough for him to see the cold, analytical spark that ignited deep within her. He was a type she knew well, a man of immense power who saw the world as a collection of assets and liabilities, of tools and obstacles. People like her were tools, to be used efficiently and then put away. It was a worldview that made such men powerful, but also profoundly blind. She retreated to the service station, her movements unhurried. The encounter left a familiar, metallic taste in her mouth. She had spent years in a past life studying men like Julian Croft, mapping their financial networks, their political alliances, their hidden vulnerabilities. They built fortresses of wealth and influence, never understanding that the most significant threats often come from the places they refuse to look. From her vantage point, she watched Graves direct Croft's primary bodyguard, a younger man, to a position near the main entrance. Graves himself took a seat at a small adjacent table, positioning himself between Croft and the rest of the room. It was a standard, by-the-book security formation. Competent, predictable, but Allara's training had been in the world of asymmetrical threats, of dangers that never, ever read the book. She began polishing a wine glass, her mind a silent, whirring calculator of angles, exits, and choke points. The restaurant's name, The Sovereign, suddenly felt less like a mark of luxury and more like a challenge, a claim of dominance waiting to be contested. The water arrived. The wine was presented to Croft's lawyer for approval. For the next 40 minutes, a tense but stable routine settled over the alcove. Croft and his lawyer spoke in low, urgent tones, their heads bent over the briefcase. Graves sat like a stone sentinel, his eyes in constant motion. Allara served the tables around them, but the vigilant part of her mind, the part she called the auditor, was humming at a higher frequency. It was a sixth sense, born not of magic but of intense training in pattern recognition. It was the feeling of a carefully constructed ledger being subtly, deliberately unbalanced. The imbalance came in the form of 5 men. They entered over a span of 15 minutes, not as a group but as disconnected individuals, a tactic designed to defeat cursory surveillance. To anyone else, they were just another collection of wealthy patrons, a pair of real estate developers, a solo diner, 2 men meeting for a late business dinner. But Allara's mind processed the data points that others missed, and the picture that emerged was terrifying. The first 2 men were seated at a table directly across from Croft's alcove. They ordered a bottle of exorbitantly priced Cabernet, but Allara, in her silent sweeps of the room, noted their glasses remained untouched. Their conversation appeared jovial, but their eyes were cold, their gazes sweeping the room in disciplined, overlapping arcs. They weren't enjoying the ambience. They were establishing a baseline and monitoring for deviations. The third man, the solo diner, was given a small table near the bar. He ordered an appetizer and seemed engrossed in his phone. But Allara noticed his position gave him a perfect mirror-back view of Graves and the main bodyguard. Furthermore, he wasn't scrolling through his phone. He was holding it steady, the screen dark. He was likely recording, providing a live intelligence feed. The fourth and fifth men entered together and requested a table near the kitchen doors. This was the detail that set off alarm bells in Allara's head. It was the least desirable area of the restaurant, but it was a key tactical point. It controlled a primary escape route in a staff thoroughfare. They were laughing loudly, projecting an air of boisterous camaraderie, but their posture told a different story. Both sat with their backs to the wall, feet planted firmly, ready to spring into action. They were coiled springs of potential energy. Allara felt an icy dread seep into her bones. This was a professional envelopment, a classic 5-point tactical setup. Croft was the target. Her training screamed at her, observe, orient, decide, act. Her first instinct was to dismiss it as hypervigilance, a phantom limb from her amputated past. But the details were too clean, too coordinated. The way their suits, while expensive, were cut slightly loose to conceal body armor or weapons. The way they all wore the same style of inconspicuous earpiece, the kind used by high-end security details. The way they were all methodically isolating Croft's own security. She had to warn someone. On the pretense of checking on a table nearby, she moved into Graves's orbit. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice low and steady as she paused by his table. Graves looked up, his expression a mixture of annoyance and confusion. "What is it?" "Your principal is in imminent danger," she whispered, her eyes focused on a point just over his shoulder, avoiding direct contact. "There is a 5-man team in this room. They are professionals. 2 at table 11, 1 at table 7, 2 by the kitchen. They have you bracketed." A flicker of condescending amusement crossed Graves' face. He performed a slow, deliberate scan of the room, his gaze resting for a moment on the men Allara had indicated. He saw exactly what he was trained to see. Men in suits. "Young lady," he said, his voice a patronizing rumble, "I've been protecting men like Mr. Croft since before you were born. I know what a threat looks like. These are businessmen. Now please go back to pouring wine and let the professionals handle security." Frustration, hot and sharp, flared in Allara's chest. "You're not listening," she insisted, her whisper more urgent. "Their positioning isn't for dining. It's for containment. The man at table 7 isn't looking at his phone. He's giving you a direct line of sight in the bar mirror. The 2 by the kitchen are controlling your exfiltration route." Graves's jaw tightened. "I have men covering every exit. The situation is secure. Now I will not tell you again. Step away. You're making a scene." He turned his back to her, a final, emphatic dismissal. He had already profiled her. A waitress with an overactive imagination, perhaps trying to impress the boss. The arrogance of the expert, the inability to accept critical intelligence from a source deemed unworthy, was a fatal flaw. She had seen it lead to disaster before. She was alone. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, syncopated rhythm against the smooth jazz playing over the restaurant's sound system. She could walk. She could go to the kitchen, feign illness, and slip out the back exit. This wasn't her fight. She had renounced that world. Croft was an arrogant man who had treated her like an object. Why should she risk her carefully constructed new life, her very existence, for him? Then her gaze swept across the rest of the room, the young couple at table 8, clearly on a nervous first date, the elderly couple celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary. They were all just background scenery in this unfolding drama, lambs in a meticulously prepared slaughterhouse. Her promise to herself to remain a ghost was one thing, but the core of her old identity, the deeply ingrained imperative to protect the unsuspecting from the wolves, was another. It was the one part of her she could never fully erase. She moved back to her station, her mind a blur of calculations. The restaurant was no longer a dining room, it was a battle space. The distance between tables became firing lanes. A heavy silver water pitcher became a blunt force instrument. The long, sharp knives used for carving roasts tableside, the boiling water in the espresso machine, the pressurized CO2 canisters behind the bar. Everything was a resource, a potential weapon, a variable in an equation that was about to be solved with violence. Across the room, she saw the man at table 7 subtly tap his phone screen twice. It was the signal. The leader of the pair at table 11 touched his earpiece. The hunters tensed. The trap was set. And Allara Vance, the ghost in the apron, made her decision. She would not be a ghost tonight. She would be the thing the ghosts hunt. She took a deep, steadying breath, the rich, decadent air of the sovereign feeling thin and cold in her lungs, and she began to move, not as a waitress, but as an auditor coming to collect on a debt. The first move was a masterpiece of silent coordination. The solo diner at table 7 stood up, his hand reaching inside his tailored jacket. At the exact same moment, the two men by the kitchen rose as one, their friendly facade evaporating to reveal faces of cold, hard purpose. The energy in the room shifted instantly, the pleasant hum of conversation replaced by a sudden, predatory silence. Graves, for all his condescending pride, was no amateur. He saw the coordinated movement, and the years of training finally overrode his complacency. "Sir, down!" he barked, shoving Julian Croft, who was looking up in bewildered irritation, deeper into the booth. Graves's hand went for the Sig Sauer holstered at the small of his back, but he was a fraction of a second too late. He was reacting to their action. The man from table 7 was already upon Croft's main bodyguard by the entrance. There was no shout, no gunshot, just a swift, brutal movement and the sickening, wet crunch of a garrote wire biting deep. The bodyguard collapsed without a sound, his eyes wide with surprise. It was ruthlessly efficient. Panic erupted. A woman shrieked, a sound that tore through the refined atmosphere like a blade. Diners began to scramble, a chaotic wave of fear and confusion. The symphony of clinking silverware was replaced by the crash of breaking glass and the thud of overturned chairs. The two men from table 11 converged on Graves. They moved with the terrifying fluid synergy of a practiced team. Before Graves could get a clean shot, one of them kicked a heavy serving cart into his path, forcing him to check his aim. The second man closed the distance in that brief moment of distraction, not with a gun, but with a taser, its twin prongs crackling with blue energy. The high-voltage charge slammed into Graves, his body locking up in a violent seizure as he fell, his pistol clattering uselessly to the floor. It had taken less than 7 seconds to completely dismantle Croft's professional security. The remaining two men, the ones from the kitchen station, now moved to control the terrified crowd. They drew sleek, compact submachine guns from messenger bags they had carried in. "Nobody move!" one of them shouted, his voice calm and commanding, a chilling counterpoint to the surrounding hysteria. "On the floor! Hands on your heads! This is not your concern. Our business is with Mr. Croft." The leader, a tall, gaunt man with pale reptilian eyes who had been at table 11, strode toward Croft's alcove. He moved with the unhurried confidence of a surgeon approaching an operating table. He ignored the whimpering patrons, his focus absolute. Julian Croft, the man who could move global markets with a single phone call, looked utterly helpless. His face was the color of ash, his lifelong armor of power and influence stripped away to reveal the raw, primal fear of a man whose world had just been hijacked. Allara had used that first violent burst of chaos. While others screamed and hid, she moved with quiet purpose. She didn't run. She flowed toward the epicenter of the violence, using the panic of the herd as her camouflage. She slid behind the long, granite-topped bar, crouching low. The young bartender, Marco, was huddled there, his body trembling uncontrollably. "Call 911, she commanded in a low, sharp whisper that cut through his terror. "Put the phone on the counter and keep the line open. Do not speak." Marco fumbled with his phone, his fingers too slick with sweat to work the touchscreen. Allara snatched it from him, her own fingers a blur as she dialed, hit call, and slid the phone onto the floor, the open line a silent beacon to the outside world. She rose just enough to peer over the bar's edge. The leader, whom she mentally designated the surgeon, stood over Croft. In his hand was a heavy military-grade tablet and a stylus. "Julian," he said, his voice surprisingly soft, almost gentle. "No need for unpleasantness. There is a transfer document on this screen, a controlling interest in Croft Holdings to a new parent company. You will provide your biometric signature, and then we will be on our way. Simple. He reached for Croft's hand. That was when Allara acted. She had no gun, no tactical gear, but the bar was an arsenal of improvised weapons. Her hand closed around a full, unopened bottle of Blanton's bourbon, its weight solid and comforting. In one smooth, explosive motion, she rose from behind the bar. "Get away from him!" she yelled. The surgeon turned, his eyes narrowing with cold annoyance at this unexpected variable. He saw the waitress, the servant, the non-entity. He opened his mouth to spit a command, to order her to the floor. He never got the chance. Allara swung the bourbon bottle, not like a club, but like an axe, putting her entire body weight and momentum into a low, horizontal arc aimed at his knee. Years of self-defense training, the brutal, pragmatic kind designed for escaping, not fighting, had taught her to target joints, not hardened muscle. The surgeon, anticipating a wild swing at his head, was completely unprepared. The thick glass bottle connected with the side of his knee with a sound like a frozen tree branch snapping. The bottle shattered, spraying bourbon in glass shards, but not before it had done its work. The surgeon screamed, a raw, guttural sound of pure agony, as his leg buckled beneath him and he crumpled to the floor, clutching the ruined joint. The element of surprise was a finite resource, and she had just spent it all. The other four men snapped their attention to her, their expressions of shock quickly hardening into murderous rage. The two with submachine guns began to bring their weapons to bear. The man who had tased Graves started moving toward her, a look of cruel anticipation on his face. The fifth man, who had dispatched the bodyguard, circled around the far end of the bar, cutting off her escape. They were closing in, a tightening noose. 4 trained operators against 1 waitress. The odds were suicidal, but Allara's face was a mask of cold, analytical calm. The fear was a knot of ice in her stomach, but it was a familiar cold. She had learned long ago how to pack that fear down, to use it as ballast, to keep her steady in the storm. The waitress was a shed skin. In her place stood someone else, a woman forged in the quiet, ruthless world of forensic accounting, where a single misplaced decimal point could topple an empire. The sovereign had become a hostile balance sheet, and she was about to violently correct it. The restaurant, which had been a pit of panicked whimpers, fell into a collective, awestruck silence. The patrons, the staff, and Julian Croft himself watched, paralyzed with disbelief, as the quiet waitress transformed into something terrifyingly competent. Her entire demeanor shifted. Her body settled into a low, stable stance, balanced on the balls of her feet. Her eyes, once deferential, now burned with an icy fire, darting between the 4 advancing men, calculating trajectories, prioritizing threats, executing a survival strategy in the space of a heartbeat. The man who had used the taser man, reached her first, a confident sneer on his face. He lunged, reaching for her, intending to overpower her with sheer size and strength. Allara didn't back away. She moved into the attack, a blur of motion. As he grabbed for her shoulder, she dropped her center of gravity, letting his momentum carry him slightly off balance. Her right hand shot out, not in a punch, but with her fingers rigid, jabbing the sensitive pressure point just below his sternum. It was a move designed to disrupt the diaphragm and create a moment of breathless paralysis. He grunted, the air forced from his lungs, his forward motion stalling for a critical second. In that second, Allara grabbed the heavy silver water pitcher from the bar top. She didn't swing it. She pivoted, driving the sharp, ornate edge of the pitcher's base directly into his temple. The impact was sickeningly solid. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed like a marionette with its strings cut. 1 down, but the 2 gunmen, SMG-1 and SMG-2, were now adjusting their aim, trying to get a clear shot without hitting their own men. The panicked diners provided a chaotic, shifting backdrop that made their task difficult. Pop, pop, pop. A short, suppressed burst from SMG-1 stitched a line of holes across the bar front, splintering the dark wood where Allara's head had been moments before. She was already moving, vaulting over the bar to land in a silent crouch on the other side. The 5th man, Garrote, was rounding the edge to meet her. He was fast, pulling a long, wicked-looking combat knife from a sheath on his belt. He feinted high, then slashed low, a professional, disciplined attack. Allara's hand shot out and snatched two objects from a service tray, a heavy linen napkin and a long, steel-pronged carving fork. As the knife slashed toward her, she threw the unfolded napkin directly into his face. It was a flimsy, ridiculous defense, but it momentarily blinded him, forcing him to react instinctively, to flinch. That was all she needed. She lunged forward, not away, driving the carving fork with all her strength into the thick muscle of his thigh. It wasn't a lethal blow, but the pain was excruciating and debilitating. He screamed and staggered back, his leg giving out as he tried to pull the deeply embedded tines from his flesh. Julian Croft watched from his booth, his mind reeling, unable to reconcile the woman who had just served him water with the whirlwind of brutal, precise violence he was now witnessing. This wasn't a brawl. It was a series of calculated, efficient neutralizations. She wasn't fighting like a soldier. She was fighting like an auditor finding and exploiting fatal weaknesses in a flawed system. Now only two were left, SMG-1 and SMG-2, positioned near the kitchen. They had clearer fields of fire now, and rising from the floor, his face a mask of incandescent fury, was the surgeon. His leg was useless, but he had pulled a handgun from an ankle holster. "Shoot her! Shoot the bitch now!" he roared, his voice distorted with pain. SMG-1 raised his weapon, taking careful aim. Allara was in the open. She grabbed a full, heavy tray of dirty dishes, thick ceramic plates, heavy silverware, and hurled it sidearm like a discus. The tray flew through the air, a chaotic explosion of metal and porcelain that crashed into SMG-1's chest and face. It wasn't enough to injure him seriously, but it staggered him, forcing him to reset his aim. In that brief window, Allara sprinted, not away, but directly toward the kitchen. She burst through the swinging doors just as a bullet whizzed past her ear, shattering a stack of plates on a shelf inside. The kitchen was its own world of heat, steam, and steel. The terrified kitchen staff were huddled in the pantry. "Stay back!" Allara yelled, her voice echoing with an authority that none of them dared question. Her eyes swept the room, instantly inventorying its potential. A rack of razor-sharp chef's knives, a deep fryer filled with 375-degree oil, heavy cast-iron skillets, a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. SMG-2 burst in after her, his weapon held ready. He saw her seemingly cornered by the massive steel prep tables. He smiled. He was wrong. She wasn't cornered. She was in her armory. She ripped a heavy iron skillet from its overhead hook. As he lunged forward, she didn't swing it at his head. She swung it low, a vicious backhand strike that connected squarely with his kneecap. The sound of shattering bone was sickeningly loud in the enclosed space. He howled and went down, his submachine gun skittering across the greasy floor. The surgeon, hobbling and using the doorframe for support, appeared in the doorway, his pistol leveled. "You are a very surprising woman," he hissed through clenched teeth. "And now you are a dead one." Allara's eyes darted to the deep fryer. Before he could fire, she grabbed a wire basket full of French fries and flung the contents, a spray of sizzling, oil-slick potatoes, directly at his face and gun hand. He shrieked as the scalding oil hit his skin, his hand spasming involuntarily. His shot went wide, punching a hole in a stainless steel refrigerator. Allara moved past the downed SMG-2, scooping up his weapon. She wasn't a firearms expert, but her agency training had included basic proficiency with common criminal hardware. She checked the magazine and racked the slide in a single, fluid motion. She was armed. She stepped back out into the dining room, the compact submachine gun held in a low, ready stance. The room was deathly quiet. The only one left was SMG-1, who had recovered from the tray of dishes. He was standing over Julian Croft's booth, holding the terrified lawyer in a headlock, his own weapon pressed to the man's temple. "Drop it!" he screamed, his voice high-pitched with panic. "Drop it now, or his brains get painted on the upholstery." Allara didn't drop the gun. Her expression was unreadable. She raised the weapon, sighting down the barrel. "Let him go," she said, her voice impossibly calm. "You're crazy, I'll kill him," the gunman shrieked, his eyes wide and wild. "You're right," Allara said, taking a small, deliberate step to her left, adjusting her firing angle. You probably will, but you need to understand something about the men you work for. A dead hostage is a failed operation. A dead operator is an acceptable loss. You are an acceptable loss. She took another slow step. They won't pay you. They'll erase your family's existence to cover their tracks. You have already failed. The only question now is whether you die here or in a ditch somewhere after your employers clean up their own mess. Her words were a scalpel of psychological warfare, cutting through his panic and inserting the cold poison of doubt. She saw his trigger finger hesitate. She saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes as he processed the cold, cruel logic of her statement. In that split second of internal conflict, she acted. She didn't fire at him. She fired a single shot into the massive ornate crystal chandelier hanging directly above him. The bullet shattered the central support. The chandelier, a half-ton behemoth of crystal and brass, groaned, tilted, and then crashed downward. The gunman looked up, his face a mask of pure horror, and was buried under an avalanche of glittering destruction. He never fired a shot. Silence. A profound, ringing silence broken only by the soft tinkle of settling crystal and the distant, approaching wail of sirens. Allara stood in the center of the ruined dining room, the submachine gun now pointed safely at the floor. She looked at Julian Croft, who was staring at her from his booth, his face a canvas of utter, world-altering shock. His fortress had been breached, his guards defeated, and his savior was the waitress he had dismissed as a piece of furniture. The wail of sirens crescendoed into a maelstrom of flashing blue and red lights that painted the restaurant's opulent interior in stark, frantic strokes. The first wave of Chicago PD officers burst through the doors, weapons drawn, their faces a mixture of hardened professionalism and shock at the scene before them. The room was a tableau of carnage and luxury. Unconscious assailants lay amidst shattered crystal and overturned tables, while terrified patrons were slowly, tremulously emerging from their hiding places. Allara remained still, a calm island in the center of the chaos. The compact submachine gun was placed carefully on the floor, kicked a few feet away from her. The combat adrenaline, that cold, clarifying fire, was beginning to recede, leaving in its wake the familiar, hollow ache of a past she could never truly outrun. Her analytical mind was still working, cataloging the officers, their positions, their weaponry. It was a habit she couldn't break, a program that was always running in the background of her consciousness. A heavy-set detective with weary eyes and a trench coat that had seen better decades pushed through the uniforms. His name tag read, Harding. He was in charge. His gaze swept the room, taking in the 5 neutralized attackers, the specific and varied nature of their injuries. A destroyed knee, a caved-in temple, a deep thigh wound from a fork, and finally his eyes landed and stayed on Allara. He saw her stance, the unnatural calm in her eyes, and the way she held herself, as if she were a coiled spring even at rest. "You the one who did this?" Harding asked, his voice a low, skeptical gravel. "They were a threat to the civilians," Allara stated, her voice flat. It was a report, not a justification. Before Harding could respond, Julian Croft, having been helped from his booth by a patrolman, pushed forward. His expensive suit was torn and spattered with wine, his face pale, but his eyes were fixed on Allara with a burning, desperate intensity he normally reserved for hostile takeover bids. "She saved us," Croft said, his voice hoarse with shock. "She saved all of us. They were going to. They had documents. She took them all down. 5 of them." Harding raised a skeptical eyebrow, his gaze shifting from the slight waitress to the 5 large, unconscious men who looked like they'd been put through a meat grinder. The story was preposterous, yet the evidence was irrefutable and scattered across his crime scene. "We're going to need a full statement, Miss Vance," Allara supplied. "Allara Vance. She doesn't need to give you a damn thing until my legal team gets here," Croft snapped, a measure of his old command returning, but now it was a shield for her. "This woman is a hero. She needs a commendation. Whatever she wants, it's hers." He turned to Allara, his expression one of profound, disoriented gratitude. "My lawyers will handle everything." Allara finally looked at him, her eyes as cold and clear as ice. "I don't have lawyers, Mr. Croft, and I don't want anything from you." The finality in her tone, the utter dismissal of his power and wealth, seemed to stun Croft more than the attack itself. He, a man whose favor could make or break fortunes, was being completely shut down by the woman who had just saved his life. "But I owe you," he stammered, his mind struggling to process this new reality. "My life, my company." "There is no debt," Allara replied, turning her gaze back to Detective Harding. "They initiated a hostile action. I neutralized the threat. The accounting is settled." She spent the next 3 hours in a quiet, cleared-out section of the restaurant, giving Harding a meticulously edited version of the night's events. She was Allara Vance, a waitress. The men created a panic. She got scared. She fought back with whatever was at hand. She described a chaotic, desperate struggle for survival, a series of lucky breaks and adrenaline-fueled reactions. She carefully omitted any detail that hinted at training, analysis, or tactical thinking. Harding listened, his pen scratching methodically in his small notebook, but his eyes told her he wasn't buying the performance. A bourbon bottle to the knee, a water pitcher, a carving fork, a tray of dishes, and a chandelier, he recited, looking up from his notes. "You neutralize 5 armed professionals with items from a waitress's station. That isn't luck, Miss Vance. That's a very particular set of skills." "It was a confusing situation," Allara maintained, her face a blank canvas. "Right," Harding grunted, unconvinced. "I've worked violent crimes in this city for 30 years. I know what a confusing situation looks like. It usually involves a lot more innocent people getting hurt. There's a file I'm supposed to remember when I look at you, but it isn't there." He closed his notebook with a sigh. "All right, for now you're a hero witness. You're free to go. But stay in the city. We will have more questions." As Allara prepared to leave, Antoine, the maître d', intercepted her. His normally composed face was a mess of awe and gratitude. "Allara," he whispered, pressing a thick envelope into her hand. "Your wages. And this," he offered a second, much thicker envelope. "This is from the ownership. They said, well, thank you feels inadequate." Allara looked at the money. It was enough to disappear and start over somewhere new, somewhere far away. She took the envelope with her pay and pushed the second one back into his hand. "Just my pay is fine, Antoine. I was just doing my job." She stepped out into the frigid Chicago night, the wail of sirens now a part of the city's ambient hum. She pulled up the collar of her thin coat and melted into the shadows, ignoring the news crews that were now setting up their lights and cameras. Across the street, shielded by the tinted windows of a black town car, Julian Croft watched her walk away until she was swallowed by the darkness. He was on the phone, not with the police, but with his real head of security, a private contractor based in D.C. who specialized in problems money alone couldn't solve. "I don't care what it costs or what databases you have to crack," Croft said, his voice low and hard as iron. "I want to know who she is, not the waitress, the woman who just took down 5 operators with kitchenware. I want her entire history, financial records, government service, everything. Find out what she was before she was Allara Vance." He paused, watching the empty space where she had vanished. "And find out who sent those men. They weren't after a ransom. They were after a signature. That means they're not done. By saving me, she's made herself their primary target." He hung up, a cold, unfamiliar feeling settling in his gut. It wasn't just gratitude. It was responsibility. An act of such impossible violence would have consequences, creating ripples that would spread far and wide. The men she'd taken down were pawns in a much larger, deadlier game, and Allara Vance had just knocked over the entire board. Julian Croft, for the first time in his life, felt a debt that couldn't be repaid with money. It would have to be paid in kind. The first rule of disappearing is to become noise, not silence. Silence is a vacuum that draws attention. Noise is camouflage. Within hours of the incident at the Sovereign, Allara Vance began the meticulous process of dissolving back into the static of urban life. She didn't just pack a bag, she executed an identity shutdown protocol. Her small, sterile apartment was wiped clean, not just of her possessions, but of her presence. She used a chemical agent to eliminate latent fingerprints and erase the hard drives of her laptop and burner phone with a multi-pass algorithm that would frustrate any forensic analyst. She closed her bank account, converting her meager savings into untraceable cash. Allara Vance, the waitress, was now a ghost. She took a bus to the south side, to a neighborhood of brick tenements and forgotten factories, a place where people learn not to ask questions. She paid cash for a room above a laundromat, using a fake name and a story about a bad breakup. She bought ill-fitting clothes from a charity shop, adopted a limp, and wore a pair of non-prescription glasses. Her goal was not to be invisible, but to be forgettable. The quiet, carefully constructed peace she had built for herself had been sacrificed in 7 minutes of violence. And now she was back where she started, in the shadows, listening, waiting. She knew they would come. Not Harding and the Chicago PD, but the people who had employed the surgeon. A corporation powerful enough to attempt a hostile takeover via armed force would not tolerate a loose end, especially one as lethally competent as she had proven to be. Meanwhile, Julian Croft was mobilizing his empire. The search for Allara Vance became the sole priority of a discreet, off-the-books unit within Croft Holdings, a team of former intelligence analysts and data miners he kept on retainer for corporate espionage. They were the best private intelligence unit money could buy, digital ghosts who could navigate the darkest corners of the web. But Allara was a ghost of a different breed. For 2 weeks, they hit a wall of meticulously constructed nothingness. Her social security number was valid, but led to a history that was clearly fabricated, created just under 2 years ago. Her employment history was a trail of ghost companies and defunct diners. No school records, no medical history, no digital footprint beyond the bare minimum required to exist in modern society. It was a masterpiece of erasure. "This is professional," Croft's contractor, a man named Bennett, reported over a secure line. "This isn't someone hiding from a bad debt, Mr. Croft. This is a state-level identity scrub. The holes in her past have been deliberately patched with plausible but empty data. We're looking at a ghost sanctioned by a very powerful agency." Croft became more consumed with each passing day. He had the security footage from the Sovereign digitally enhanced, watching it on a loop in his study. He analyzed her every move, the way she used leverage instead of strength, the cold precision of her strikes, the utter lack of hesitation. This wasn't a soldier. This was an analyst, an auditor who had been given teeth. Who was she? The breakthrough, when it came, was from an unexpected direction. Croft had his team investigate the documents on the surgeon's tablet, which had been recovered by the police. Bennett's team hacked the evidence locker's network and downloaded a copy. The documents proposed a transfer of Croft Holdings to a shell corporation named Ethelred Acquisitions. It was a dead end, a ghost company. But Allara had taught Croft to look for the patterns beneath the surface. He instructed Bennett's team not to trace the company, but to analyze the legal boilerplate, the specific phrasing and clauses used in the transfer agreement. It took them 4 days, running the text through a proprietary algorithm that cross-referenced it with millions of legal and financial documents. They found a match. The exact same esoteric phrasing appeared in the incorporation documents of a private military contractor named OmniSec Solutions, a company Croft knew well. They were a ruthless competitor in the world of global logistics and security, known for their aggressive and often unethical tactics. OmniSec was run by a man named Marcus Thorne, a new money vulture who had been trying to force a merger with Croft Holdings for years. This wasn't foreign espionage. This was a local, brutal business dispute. The motive was clear. But who was Allara? The answer came from an old, almost forgotten contact of Croft's, a retired Treasury Department official. Croft called in a favor, feeding the official the name Allara Vance and the context of the attack. 2 days later, the official called back, his voice hushed and nervous. "The name is a fabrication, Julian," the official whispered. "But the incident you described, the skills, it triggered a deep state keyword flag. There was an analyst, a forensic accountant at FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Brilliant, a prodigy at untangling terrorist financing and corporate shell games. 5 years ago, she was assigned to a task force investigating massive fraud among military contractors. OmniSec was one of her targets. She uncovered a scheme to embezzle billions from Defense Department contracts. But it went deeper. The corruption went all the way to the top of the task force itself. Before she could submit her final report, there was an incident, a car bomb. She was declared dead. Her name was redacted from every file. They erased her. The pieces slammed into place in Croft's mind with the force of a physical blow. Allara wasn't a soldier who had gone into hiding. She was a whistleblower who had been targeted for elimination by a conspiracy between a corrupt corporation and the very government officials meant to be policing it. She had survived and built a new life as a ghost because her own country had tried to murder her. And by saving him, she had inadvertently stumbled right back into the path of Marcus Thorne and OmniSec, the very people she'd been running from. They wouldn't just see her as a loose end from the restaurant. They would recognize the ghost who had come back to haunt them. Bennett's team, using the new information, finally found her. They cross-referenced known FinCEN agent profiles with facial recognition software, running it against city surveillance cameras. They found a match on a bus camera on the south side, a woman in glasses with a slight limp. They tracked her to the tenement above the laundromat. Croft knew he had to go himself. This wasn't a message he could delegate. He had dragged her out of the shadows, and now her past and his present were on a collision course, with her standing at the point of impact. He told Bennett to stand down, to pull all surveillance. He would approach her alone. The hallway outside her room smelled of bleach and fried onions. It was a different universe from the oak and leather of the Sovereign. Julian Croft, dressed in a simple cashmere sweater and slacks, felt like an alien in this environment. He knocked on the door of room 2B. The sound was flat and dull. Silence. He knocked again, harder this time. He heard a faint scraping sound from within, then the click of multiple locks being disengaged. The door opened barely 2 inches, held by a thick brass chain. One of Allara's eyes, sharp and suspicious, appeared in the gap. "What do you want, Croft?" Her voice was a low growl, stripped of all pretense of the deferential waitress. "I need to talk to you," he said, his own voice tight. "It's not safe. I know who they are, and I think I know who you are." He saw the flicker of alarm in her eye. After a long, tense moment where she was clearly scanning the hallway behind him, the chain slid back. The door opened. "You have 2 minutes." The room was a monk's cell, a mattress on the floor, a single wooden chair, and a beat-up backpack leaning against the wall, clearly packed and ready. This wasn't a life. It was a holding pattern. "The men in the restaurant worked for Marcus Thorne," Croft said, wasting no time. "OmniSec Solutions." Allara's expression remained neutral, but her posture stiffened. She didn't seem surprised, merely confirmed. "I suspected it was something like that. They weren't just trying to take my company," Croft continued, his voice low and urgent. "Thorne was one of the targets of your investigation 5 years ago, wasn't he? The FinCEN task force." Her mask of calm finally fractured. A raw, hunted look flashed in her eyes. "How do you know that?" she whispered, the words barely audible. "I have resources," he said simply. "You weren't just a waitress caught in the crossfire, were you? You recognize the pattern because you've seen their books. You've seen the rot from the inside. They didn't just try to kidnap me. They found you." "They didn't find me," she shot back, her voice laced with a bitter fury. "You led them to me. You are a lighthouse, Croft. Your wealth, your power, it attracts predators. I was dark. I was silent. Then I made the mistake of getting caught in your beam." Her words were daggers of truth, and they found their mark. He felt a profound sense of guilt, heavier than any business failure he had ever experienced. "You're right," he said quietly. "I did, and I am here to fix it. Thorne won't stop. He knows his ghost is back. He will throw everything he has at you to finish the job he started 5 years ago." "And what do you propose?" she asked, her arms crossed, a bitter smile on her lips. "You're going to protect me? Hide me in one of your penthouses? I've been hiding from men like him, and from men in our own government who are on his payroll, for 5 years. You can't protect me from that." "No," Croft said, meeting her gaze. "I'm not going to protect you. I'm not going to hide you. I'm going to finance you. I'm going to arm you. You were a forensic accountant who got too close to the truth, and they tried to kill you for it. You have the knowledge. You know where all the bodies are buried in his financial statements. I have the resources, the political access, the legal firepower to make that knowledge a weapon. He took a step closer, his voice dropping with intensity. You've been on the defensive for 5 years, Allara. Running, hiding. It's time to stop running. It's time to finish the audit. Together we can burn his entire corrupt empire to the ground. Not just for what he did to me, for what he did to you. Allara stared at him, her mind racing. For 5 years, her life had been about survival, about staying invisible. The thought of turning back, of facing the monster she had fled, was terrifying. But the thought of spending the rest of her life looking over her shoulder was a different kind of death sentence. Croft was offering her something she hadn't had in a long time. A fighting chance. An opportunity not just to survive, but to win. The alliance was unholy. The old money titan and the disavowed government ghost. The ultimate insider and the ultimate outsider. It was a desperate gamble, born of violence and necessity. But as she looked at the determined, guilt-ridden face of Julian Croft, she saw the truth of his offer. He wasn't offering her sanctuary. He was offering her revenge. And for the first time in 5 years, Allara Vance felt something other than fear. It felt like hope, cold and sharp as a shard of glass. "Okay, Croft," she said, her voice steady and clear. "You want to finish the audit? Let's open the books.